Okay, so we're going to start out with part one, which is preparation. In missions, preparation is 80% of everything, and then it's 20% implementation. If you do not prepare well or plan well, then your outcome as far as the mission outreach is going to have problems because you didn't plan or prepare well. I really want to stress that it's very important that you have the proper preparation for any type of mission outreach that you go on. The first part I'm going to discuss briefly is spiritual. You have to have spiritual preparation. And there's 4 things that you really need to focus on. The first one, spend time with the Lord in prayer and His Word. You have to take time for spiritual formation. Really, that goes for anything, whether at your regular job or in your family, in a marriage. You have to take time to spend with the Lord. Don't confuse what you're doing on the mission as your relationship with God. There are 2 distinct things, but sometimes we as Christians kind of merge the 2 together or think they're the same thing, but when it really isn't. And third one is God views your spiritual development more important than the mission itself. You really have to realize how important this is, that God really is concerned about you just as much as He's concerned about the people that you go to minister to. And the last one is develop your spiritual ear to hear the voice of the Lord. You do this from reading His Word and then allowing others to speak into your life. Then the second one that we're going to go to is the physical and emotional readiness. There's a journal article in the Christian Journal of Nursing by Christopher Bakowitz. He did an article called Staying Healthy Overseas. And I really liked his acronym that he shared. It's called S.E.E.K Wisdom. And so I adopted this into this course because it's a very valuable tool, and it really helps you to remember what things you need to review in getting ready to go on a mission outreach. The first one, of course, for S.E.E.K is S, which is safety first. So, most accidents or injuries that can occur on a mission outreach are usually it's accidents. When you're in a vehicle, you need to use the seat belts. When you're traveling, it should be during the daytime. It really shouldn't be at night because things are a lot more dangerous, especially in third world countries at nighttime. Make sure that the vehicles are in good working order. Investigate safety records of the regional bus or airline services. If you're going across water in a boat, you definitely have to wear a life jacket. And you should never swim alone. Also be aware of fire, smoke, heat, or electrical dangers. In a lot of these third world countries, there's no such thing as OSHA, so there's no any type of safety organizations to control things that could happen, whether as far as electricity or any other type of equipment. So you need to be cognizant of that. Next, of course, is E, which stands for everyone uniquely covered. You need to be aware of your own personal health. You need to look at the trip that you're going on and decide, is this something that I can really do physically? It really depends on what type of mission outreach it is. If there's going to be a lot of hiking over rough terrain, or you have a problem with your back, you really have to look at what type of strenuous activities are you going to be doing on this mission trip. So you definitely have to be aware of your personal health that is going on with you. You also need to be aware of exposures to infants and children. Depending on the type of outreach that you go on, it may be all adults, or if there's children involved, that's another parameter that you're going to have to look at because it changes things when infants or children aren't on a mission outreach. I really wouldn't suggest that an infant should go on any type of mission trip. Naturally, on long-term missions where a missionary is there for several years, of course, infants will be there because lots of times children are born on the mission field. But just for a short-term mission trip, it really should be either older children and adults. If you're pregnant, you need to check with your obstetrician if you can go on this trip because of the demands and flying and different things like that. Next is to have a standby illness plan in advance. Like I said earlier, you need to be cognizant of your health history and things that you can do and things that you cannot do. So you need to have some type of plan if something should happen. Like if you're diabetic, you definitely have to have your medication with you. If you're insulin dependent, you have to have your insulin and your syringes and needles. So those type of planning has to go into that. Next is if you have a chronic disease or disability, you need to pack about 150% of what you would normally take in case there's delays. One thing I always stress in talking about missions is that you have to plan for the unexpected. Expect the unexpected. And in this day and age, lots of times there's all kinds of delays. And so if you get delayed a couple of days more than you had expected, you got to make sure that you brought enough supplies with you or medications, whatever it may be, to have available for you to use. If you need to have a physician's letter, that's a good thing to have and have it with your passport. And you also need to be aware that most places throughout the world, especially as far as third world countries, do not have any type of handicap equipment or facilities. So you need to be aware of that if you have some type of handicap. The next E is emergency ready. It'd be a good idea if you know CPR, whether you go on a mission trip or you just live here in the States, it's always good to be ready to help somebody and know CPR if there's some type of emergency. It's always a good idea to carry a first aid kit with you, especially on a team that's going to do medical. You should carry such things as IV fluids and supplies like that so that those will be available to either for the team or for the patients that you may be treating overseas. Especially if you're working in a hot country, it's very easy to get dehydrated. And so you've got to have fluids available, whether oral or IV, if that should occur where a team member or the patients you're treating are very dehydrated. One thing I want to stress here is readiness means having plans for local transport to emergency care, location maps, and available transportation. 911 does not exist in most of the world. So there's lots of times there will not be emergency facilities or vehicles to respond to the medical emergency or whatever type of emergency it is. You also have the International Association of Medical Assistants and Travelers. It's called AMAT. It provides information on English-speaking physicians worldwide. And that number is 716-754-4883. It's always a good idea to have some cash on hand, usually in the currency of that country, because most countries, especially the rural countries, do not accept insurance. They have no way of processing it. So it's always good to have cash on hand. You can get insurance through online services that cover just specifically for the trip only. And they can help out as far as any type of medical emergency that you might have. The next thing is evacuation from areas should be planned in the event of a medical necessity or civil unrest. And those things are very real. You never know when there might be a medical emergency or there could be some type of civil unrest in the country. So you need to have some type of evacuation plan intact in the event that something like this happens. Next is K, which is for know, K-N-O-W. You need to study the conditions that exist in your destination. That would be climate, terrain, resources, all those type of things. You need to be familiar with the country that you're going to. You also need to use the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control. That website is www.cdc.gov/travel. It's a key travel resource. It can let you know if there's problems with specific diseases in that country or if there's any type of security issues. You need to know your risk for robbery, violence, or unrest. Next is W, which is wash hands and watch out. Whether you're in the medical profession or healthcare profession or whatever job that you do, it's always a good idea to wash your hands. You need to wash your hands at home. You need to wash your hands when you're out. It's the number one prevention of spreading disease. You need to be washing your hands constantly, especially when you're on the mission field. Of course, one of the main problems that people encounter lots of times is diarrhea. If you get severe enough diarrhea, it can really cause you to get dehydrated. And diarrhea can result from the foods that you eat. You're not used to the foods that you're eating there, or they may be contaminated with pathogens. Also, water is another source of where pathogens can inhabit. So it's very important to know that you're drinking clean water, you're eating clean food. But in the event that you do get diarrhea, there's two things that can be done. One is oral rehydration and the other is IV fluids. And we'll go over this a little later. You may have to use some type of PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So whether it's a mask or a gown or gloves, anytime you're going to come in contact with body fluids or blood or things like that, you always need to be wearing gloves. You need to stay in groups of 3 or 4 when you're traveling. You really shouldn't be isolated by yourself going somewhere. Another important aspect is you shouldn't be giving any type of personal information to people that you do not know. Lots of times there's nationals in the country that they want to get over to the United States to live, and they will want you to sponsor them, or they want to try to get personal information from you or get your phone number. Do not give those out. Next and last thing is watch your emotions. Culture shock is a real thing, and lots of times when you see things that you're not used to, it can register in your emotions or in your face. So you need to be cognizant of being careful of not letting culture shock just overtake you. Next is I, which is immunize. So you need to have knowledge of which vaccinations are required in the country that you're going to. I know in a lot of African countries, you definitely have to be inoculated for yellow fever. It's very wise to take malaria medication because a lot of countries in Africa, malaria is endemic there. And so you'll have to have malaria medications. So you need to know your required vaccines. Oftentimes you'll have to bring your little yellow booklet that you get from your city health department, and it'll have your vaccination records on that. And lots of times you have to present that with your passport or visa when you come into the country. Required vaccines must have an official WHO, which is World Health Organization, international certificate of vaccination for country entry and exit under international law. And so it's going to be destination specific as to what type of vaccinations or medications that you need in order to get into the country. Okay, next is S for safe stuff. And this is things that you can do for your safety, especially involving eating and drinking. You need to have bottled water or some type of purified water or some type of water infiltration system or purification system as far as your water supply. You should not drink the tap water in a lot of these countries. If you do, lots of times you'll end up getting very sick, have diarrhea and other problems because of the pathogens that were in the water. Next is you're going to need to avoid eating certain foods, especially things like watermelons or cantaloupes, melons, any type of melon, because they're mostly water, and it's water that's come from the ground there, and the ground can be contaminated. So don't eat melons, watermelons, things like that. Also things like lettuce. A lot of countries you can get amoebic dysentery because of eating things that haven't been cleaned properly. You definitely shouldn't eat root-type vegetables. It should be above ground. There's a saying here, this is the type of food that you should do. Boil it, cook it, peel it, bottle it, or forget it. No raw meats, cheeses, or ice. It's kind of hard to come by ice in most of these countries. And if you do, you really have to know, was it made with purified bottled water, the ice was, or did they just use tap water? So don't use ice if you don't know where the source came from. Carry duct tape for shelter adjustments or repairs if you have to. And as far as waste, a lot of countries, they burn their waste. And so you need to know for proper disposal, especially if you're on a medical team. You have to have your hazard boxes that you can put used needles in so that they will not be available to the nationals or anybody else, and there'd be an accidental stick. So always make sure you know how to properly dispose of things while you're in another country. Next is D for don't get bitten. A lot of people just think insects, but there's more than just insects that in some of these third world countries that you can come in contact with. You can get bitten by dogs or rodents or bats, snakes. So it's just not insects like spiders or mosquitoes. Of course, in a lot of countries, malaria is very endemic, and so you do have to take precautions as far as preventing you getting malaria. The number one thing is to use mosquito netting when you sleep at night. That way you don't get bitten while you're sleeping. That tends to be when most people get bitten. It's not so much when they're outside, because a lot of people will use insect repellent when they're outside, which is a very important thing to do. Make sure that you have insect repellent with you to use in these areas where disease is prevalent through insect bites. Wear loose clothing on your arms and legs, and this will prevent bites also. Don't use perfumes, colognes, or any type of scented lotions, because the scents from these lotions can attract insects. Inspect your skin daily for like ticks or any type of rash, things that can be caused from things like scabies or lice, ticks, things like that. Do not swim in a lake or river, pond in a lot of these third world countries, because there's a lot of pathogens in those waters that you can become infected with. The main one is called schistosomiasis, and it's a little microorganism that gets into your bloodstream when you swim in these infected bodies of water, and it can cause a serious, even sometimes death. So if you're going somewhere, it's probably best to do something like a beach where it's an ocean or a swimming pool in that area that you know has properly clean water. You may be in countries where there's a lot of sunlight, so you need to take precautions and use sunscreen, because you can get very sunburned. Closer you get to the equator, the more intense the sunlight rays are, and you can burn very quickly. So always carry sunscreen with you. Next is O for oral rehydration. I touched on this a little bit earlier. You want to prevent dehydration, so you need to drink a lot of fluids, especially when you're in a hot and humid climate. Typical ways of treating this is using oral rehydration salts, which is basically salt and sugar. If you have things like Gatorade available, that would be great. If a person is severely dehydrated, then you're probably going to have to use IV fluids to get their rehydration up very quickly. because if you don't, people can die from dehydration because their kidneys begin to fail because there's not enough fluid in their bodies. The last one is M for maintain and monitor. First one is follow common sense in your daily schedule. Bring sufficient personal items. You personally know what you need to take care of yourself while you're on this trip. Monitor for community-acquired problems such as TB. There's a lot of areas where TB can be endemic. Pollution. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of countries do not have any type of pollution laws. And so there's a lot of pollution going on in the air. A lot of people cook and burn their trash in these countries. So there's a lot of smoke. So a person who has asthma or any type of respiratory problems can be affected by this. You want to observe for conjunctivitis, which is infection of your eyelids. Scabies, lice, impetigo, tinea capitis. All these are things that can happen very quickly when you're in a country where there isn't a lot of medication available for these type of things. And then last, observe for jet lag. Jet lag is a real thing. The more time zones that you go over, the more severe the jet lag can be. Like for Russia alone, Russia has 11 time zones. So if you go from one end of Russia to the other, that's 11 time zones you cross, and you can really experience jet lag. As far as we mentioned earlier about malaria, when you get back to the States, running a high fever, even with 2 years after you've been back, can be a medical alert because it could indicate that malaria is active in your body. So that would definitely have to be checked out. And of course now with COVID-19 pandemic, there's also that risk of, if you have a fever, it could be related to COVID-19. So that's it for S.E.E.K Wisdom.